Welcome to our deep dive, you guys. Today we're going to be exploring American culture in the decades leading up to the Civil War.
Oh, yeah. It's a fascinating period, a time of incredible change, really, in the arts, in literature, in society as a whole.
Yeah, we're talking about iconic landscape paintings, radical social experiments, fiery abolitionists, early feminists.
You name it, this era had it.
All right, so buckle up, because we're diving headfirst into a chapter that, honestly, is just jam-packed with amazing stories and thought-provoking ideas.
We've got tales of obsessive whale hunts, communities that redefined marriage, and even a movement that literally shook its way to equality.
Oh, I can't wait to get into that. This could be good. Whether you're a history buff or just curious about how America became America, this deep dive is guaranteed to leave you with plenty to think about.
Absolutely. So let's set the stage. We're talking about the decades before the Civil War, a time when America was really finding its voice.
Not just politically, right?
Right, but in every aspect of culture, art, literature, you name it.
Okay, well, let's start with the art scene then. It's kind of wild to think that 19th century America was producing art that rivaled Europe's.
It really is, but they were, especially in landscape painting.
Why landscapes, though?
Well, there was this real desire to capture the unique beauty and power of the American wilderness. Untamed, majestic.
So it's about more than just pretty pictures.
Oh, much more. It was about national identity, about defining what it meant to be American.
And that led to the rise of the Hudson River School.
Exactly. These were artists like Thomas Cole, Frederick Church, who were just captivated by the Hudson Valley.
I've seen some of their work, those dramatic, sweeping vistas, those almost like luminous skies.
Right? And the detail, incredible. They weren't just painting landscapes, they were capturing a feeling.
This awe, this reverence for nature. Almost spiritual, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And their work fed into this sense of national pride.
Like, hey, look at what we have here in America.
Exactly. These paintings were saying America, unlike Europe, still possesses this wild, untamed beauty.
This vastness that speaks to the American spirit.
You got it. And it wasn't just the Hudson Valley. These artists also ventured west, capturing landscapes like Yosemite, Yellowstone.
Oh, wow. And I bet those paintings just blew people's minds back east. A glimpse of this whole other world.
Absolutely. It fueled this fascination with the West, this sense of adventure, of possibility.
So you've got painters capturing the landscape, but at the same time, writers were grappling with the soul of America, right?
Oh, yes. American literature was having its own moment, exploring these very same themes.
Okay, well, where do we even begin? James Fenimore Cooper.
He's a good place to start. Really pioneered the American novel, obsessed with the frontier.
The clash between civilization and the wilderness.
Exactly. Think The Last of the Mohicans.
Oh, yeah. Classic adventure story.
Yeah, but it's also about so much more than that. It's exploring human nature, the clash of cultures, what it means to be American, all wrapped up in this thrilling story.
Then you have Walt Whitman coming along, bringing a completely different voice to American poetry.
Oh yeah, Whitman. Leaves of Grass. Revolutionary stuff.
Celebrating democracy, individuality, the human spirit, warts and all.
He was heavily influenced by the Romantic movement, but he, took it in a whole new direction. More personal, more sensual.
And wasn't he, really pushing boundaries for the
Oh,
time?
absolutely. His work hinted at his personal life, his relationships. Scandalous stuff for back then.
Makes you wonder what other stories he might have told if he hadn't felt constrained by the times.
I know. It's amazing how he used poetry to explore these themes of personal freedom, breaking free from societal expectations.
And then there's Herman Melville.
Ah.
Okay, Moby Dick is about a lot more than just a whale, right?
Oh, way more.
Like what?
It's a dark, complex tale about obsession, ambition, the human struggle against the forces of nature.
I kind of see that.
You could say Captain Ahab, with his relentless pursuit of that white whale, embodies this driven, sometimes destructive aspect of the American spirit,
Yeah, I see it. It's interesting, though, how Melville explores these darker, more psychological themes. Very different from, the romanticized landscapes we were just talking about.
Totally different vibe. And, while all this was happening up north, the South was having its own literary awakening, offering a very different perspective.
That's what's so fascinating about Southern literature, right? It grapples with a very unique set of themes and challenges.
Exactly. And of course, you can't talk about Southern literature without mentioning Edgar Allan Poe.
Poe, the master of the macabre, the raven, the telltale heart, all those haunting tales.
His work really explored the darker side of human emotion. the Gothic, the grotesque.
Yeah, Poe was in a league of his own. His writing had a huge impact, not just in America, but on writers all over the world.
It did. But while Poe was plumbing the depths of the human psyche, other Southern writers were tackling very different subjects.
Right, you had novelists like William Gilmore Simms who were writing these historical romances set in the South.
They often romanticized the plantation system, defended slavery. It was a stark contrast to what we were seeing in Northern literature.
Yeah, and it really highlights that growing divide between the two regions.
Exactly. But then you also had Southern realists who offered a more grounded, even gritty perspective on life in the South.
Like focusing on the lives of ordinary Southerners.
Yeah, people outside the plantation elite, trying to show the complexities of Southern society.
So we've got artists capturing the spirit of the American landscape, writers wrestling with identity and morality, and all this against a backdrop of intense social change.
Yeah, and if there's one group that really embodies this spirit of challenging the status quo, it's the Transcendentalists.
Okay, the Transcendentalists. They were more than just like a book club, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Way more. We're talking about a group of intellectuals, mostly in New England, who really wanted to redefine what it meant to be an individual in society.
It was all about like intuition experience, right? Trust your gut.
Yeah. They believed in the inherent goodness of humanity, and they emphasized personal experience over blind adherence to tradition.
So they were like questioning everything.
Pretty much. Organized religion, the pursuit of material wealth, all of it.
Wow. And they were advocating for.
Self-reliance, a deep connection with nature, the idea that true knowledge comes from within.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. Who are some of the key figures? Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Oh, yeah. Emerson was huge. He was a former Unitarian minister who became disillusioned with organized religion, encouraged people to find their own spiritual path.
And he was big on this idea of self-reliance, right?
Absolutely. And then there's Margaret Fuller. She was this brilliant writer and a pioneer of early feminism.
I think I've read some of her work. Wasn't she the one who wrote Woman in the 19th Century?
That's her. In that book, she argued for women's intellectual and social equality. Radical stuff for the time.
Yeah, it really challenged the idea that a woman's place was solely in the home.
Big time. But perhaps the most radical figure of them all was Henry David Thoreau.
Thoreau. Yeah, the Walden Pond guy.
Yeah.
He took self-reliance to a whole new level.
He did. Built a cabin in the woods, lived there for 2 years, just living simply, relying on his own labor and what nature provided.
Living off the grid before it was cool.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just about escaping society, right?
No. He was also deeply concerned about social justice. His experience at Walden Pond led him to develop this whole philosophy of civil disobedience.
Like the idea that you have a moral obligation to resist unjust laws.
Exactly. And his writings on this topic would go on to inspire activists like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr.
Wow, that's incredible. So these transcendentalists, they weren't just about retreating into nature and contemplating life. They were actively engaging with the social and political issues of their time.
Oh, yeah. They were definitely challenging conventional thinking and advocating for a more just and equitable society. And their concern for the natural world was a big part of that, too.
That's right. They were among the first to sound the alarm about industrialization and capitalism's impact on the environment.
They saw nature as this source of spiritual inspiration, not just something to be exploited for profit.
So were they like the original environmentalists?
In a lot of ways, yes. They argued that destroying nature would ultimately harm humanity, that true progress meant living in harmony with the natural world.
And their ideas are even more relevant today as we face our own environmental challenges.
Absolutely. They were way ahead of their time in understanding the interconnectedness of humans and nature.
It's amazing how these ideas from all those years ago still resonate so strongly today.
They do. And speaking of challenging the status quo, another fascinating aspect of this era was the rise of utopian communities.
Utopian communities, like those groups who tried to create their own perfect societies?
Yeah.
That sounds interesting.
Oh, it is. One of the most famous ones was Brook Farm, founded in 1841 by George Ripley.
Who was he?
He was a Unitarian minister and, get this, a transcendentalist.
So, like, double the idealism. What was their vision for Brook Farm?
Well, they wanted to create this community based on shared labor, intellectual pursuits, a more egalitarian way of life.
So kind of like a commune mixed with a think tank?
Yeah, something like that.
But it didn't last very long, did it?
No, sadly. They faced a lot of challenges, financial difficulties, internal conflicts, and then a fire in 1846 kind of sealed their fate.
So Back to reality.
Pretty much.
It is interesting, though, that Nathaniel Hawthorne, the writer, was actually a resident of Brook Farm for a
It
time.
was. Initially, he was all in, but he quickly became disillusioned with the whole idea.
The reality didn't quite match the ideal, huh?
Nope. And his experience there inspired his novel, The Blithedale Romance. It's actually a pretty scathing critique of transcendentalism and utopian ideals.
So even in failure, Brook Farm contributed to the cultural conversation. But they weren't the only ones trying to build a utopia, right?
Oh, no, not at all. There were tons of other utopian communities popping up all over the place.
Like what?
Well, you had New Harmony, founded in 1825 by Robert Owen.
What was their deal?
Owen was this Welsh industrialist and social reformer, and he believed in creating a society based on communal living and economic equality.
So, like, no rich, no poor, everyone shares.
Exactly. Pretty radical for the time.
I can't imagine that went over well. Did they last long?
Not really. It ultimately failed as an economic venture,
So much for utopia.
but it did inspire other Owenite communities across the country. It really speaks to this desire for a more just and equitable society, which was a driving force behind so many reform movements of this era.
And some of those communities went even further, challenging traditional family structures, gender roles.
Oh, yeah. Now things are getting really interesting. We're talking about communities that completely reimagined marriage and family as they were understood at the time.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these radical experiments.
Well, one of the most radical examples was the Oneida community.
Oneida. I think I've heard of them. What made them so different?
Well, they believed in what they called complex marriage.
Complex marriage. What's that?
Basically, every member of the community was considered married to every other member.
Wait, so no monogamy at all? Every man married to every woman and vice versa?
Exactly. They saw traditional marriage as a form of slavery for women.
And they believed in communal child rearing as well.
Yeah.
So they were really trying to create a system that liberated women and promoted complete equality.
They were. And it's fascinating because the Oneida community actually lasted for over 30 years.
Really? That's amazing. So they must have been doing something right.
Well, they were also quite successful economically. They manufactured silverware and other goods.
So their communal lifestyle allowed them to thrive.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. They
Wow.
pooled their resources and built a sustainable community.
It's just wild to think about how they challenged social norms so radically. And they weren't the only ones experimenting with alternative family structures. The Shakers were another group, right?
Oh, yeah, the Shakers, a whole different approach.
Right, the Shakers. I know they believed in celibacy, but, like, how did the communities even function?
Well, they were officially known as the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is. They were founded in the 1770s by a woman named Anne Lee. They called her Mother Anne.
Okay, so a female leader. That's interesting already.
And they believed that celibacy was the path to spiritual purity and equality between men and women.
But if no one's having children, how do you keep a community going?
They grew through conversions and by adopting orphans. They were really big on self-sufficiency, too.
Weren't they known for their craftsmanship, like all that beautiful Shaker furniture?
Yes. And they were also really innovative in their approach to agriculture. They developed all these new techniques for farming and food preservation.
Okay, so practical skills as well as spiritual beliefs.
Exactly. They were all about simple living, hard work, and equality. And of course, they had those really unique religious practices like the shaking and dancing during their services.
Oh, right. That's how they got their name.
Exactly. They believed it helped release sin and bring them closer to God.
It's just incredible how many different paths people were forging during this time, whether through utopian communities, religious movements, or artistic expression. It really was an era of experimentation and upheaval.
It was. And speaking of forging new paths, we can't forget about the rise of Mormonism, one of the most distinct and controversial religious movements in American history.
Oh yeah, the Mormons. Their story is just wild.
It really is.
It's a testament to, like, both faith and perseverance in the face of incredible hardship.
Absolutely. They went through a lot, but their faith never wavered.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. Who are the key figures in Mormonism?
Well, the founder was a young man named Joseph Smith.
And what were their core beliefs? What set them apart?
Well, Smith claimed to have received these divine revelations from an angel named Moroni.
An angel?
Yeah, and Moroni led him to this set of golden plates buried near his home in upstate New York.
Golden plates. This already sounds like something straight out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it? And Smith claimed he translated these plates, and they became the basis for the Book of Mormon.
The Book of Mormon. I've heard of it, but what's it about?
It tells the story of ancient American civilizations, their interactions with God, and the coming of Jesus Christ to the Americas.
Oh.
Yeah, pretty wild stuff. And Mormons believe the Book of Mormon is a companion to the Bible. They say it restores the true gospel of Jesus Christ, which they believe had been lost or corrupted.
So a completely new religious tradition based on these divine revelations.
Exactly. And as you can imagine, it caused quite a stir.
I bet. How did other Christians react to that?
Not well. Their claims were met with a lot of skepticism and even hostility.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
Claiming to have new scriptures and a whole new understanding of Christianity, that's bound to ruffle some feathers.
Oh, yeah. It was a huge challenge to the established religious order.
And to make matters even more controversial, didn't the early Mormons practice polygamy?
They did?
One man, multiple wives, you're really pushing boundaries there.
Oh, big time. And Smith claimed that polygamy, just like the Book of Mormon, was divinely revealed.
But it definitely didn't win them any popularity contests.
Nope. It became a major source of controversy and persecution. People were outraged.
And this persecution ultimately forced them to flee, right?
Yeah, they were driven from their settlements in Missouri, Ohio, faced violent attacks. They tried to build a community in Illinois, but even there, they couldn't escape the hostility.
So it was like a constant cycle of persecution and displacement.
Pretty much. And then, tragedy struck in 1844 when Joseph Smith was murdered by a mob.
Oh, wow, that's terrible. So what happened to the Mormons after that?
Well, with their leader gone, their future was uncertain.
They must have been lost without him.
They were. But then Brigham Young, one of Smith's closest associates, emerged as their new leader.
Wasn't he the one who led them west on that incredible journey?
He was.
The Mormon Exodus.
Exactly. They faced incredible hardships along the way.
Crossing the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains. That must have been brutal.
It was a grueling journey. But they were determined to find a place where they could practice their faith in peace.
And they ended up in the Salt Lake Valley.
They did. And there, they were able to establish a thriving community free from persecution.
So it's a story of, resilience and determination.
Absolutely.
Driven by their faith to build a new life, even in the face of such adversity. It's really remarkable.
It is. And the Mormon experience really highlights this broader theme of religious innovation and experimentation that was happening in America during this time. You had new faiths emerging, old faiths being revived. It was a real melting pot of spiritual ideas.
But alongside these new faith, there was also this powerful wave of Protestant revivalism sweeping through the nation.
It's interesting how you have these different religious impulses happening at the same time.
Right.
New faiths emerging, old faiths being revived, reinterpreted.
And these revivalists, they weren't just about personal piety, right? They were also deeply involved in all sorts of social reform movements.
Yeah.
Crusading against everything from alcohol to slavery itself.
They saw this connection between personal salvation and the betterment of society. They believed that changing individual hearts and minds was key to creating a more just and morally upright society.
So for them, it wasn't enough to just save your own soul.
Right.
You had this responsibility to address social ills.
Exactly. And this revivalist spirit had been building since the Second Great Awakening earlier in the century.
Oh, right, the Second Great Awakening. That was a period of intense religious revivalism that swept through the country, right?
It was. A lot of new Protestant denominations were founded during that time.
And by the 1820s, a new generation of evangelical preachers, known as the New Light evangelicals, were emerging.
Yes, and they were charismatic, passionate. They really emphasized personal conversion and a commitment to living a righteous life.
It sounds like their message really resonated with people.
It did, big time. Church membership surged during this time, and religious participation became central to American life, really.
So it was like a spiritual awakening for the nation.
In a lot of ways, yeah. But as we mentioned, the revivalists weren't just focused on individual salvation. They also had this really strong social conscience.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What were some of the social issues they were tackling?
Well, a big one was temperance.
Okay, the temperance movement. That was the crusade against alcohol consumption, right?
Yes. They really saw alcohol as the root of all sorts of social problems: poverty, crime, domestic violence, you name it.
So they weren't just being killjoys?
No. Alcohol consumption was much more widespread back then,
Right.
and often more potent. Drunkenness was a serious issue.
So I can see how they saw it as a threat to social order and morality.
Exactly. And the temperance movement gained widespread support, attracting people from all walks of life, including a lot of women.
And why was that? Why so many women involved?
Well, women were often the victims of alcohol-fueled domestic violence.
Right, so they had a very personal stake in this issue.
They did, and this era also saw a huge influx of immigrants, particularly from Ireland.
And didn't that play into the temperance movement as well?
It did. A lot of nativists, those who opposed immigration, associated drunkenness with these new immigrants. They saw temperance as a way to promote social control, reinforce traditional values.
So there was this element of cultural anxiety mixed in with the moral concerns about alcohol.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that social movements are often driven by multiple, sometimes competing motivations.
Right. It's never as simple as it seems.
Exactly. And, while the revivalists were focused on moral reform, there were also those working to improve health and science.
Okay, let's shift gears then and talk about what was happening in the realm of health and science.
It was a very different world back then.
Right. No antibiotics, no vaccines. People were facing all these deadly diseases with very limited medical knowledge.
Exactly. Even a simple infection could be fatal.
It must have been terrifying not knowing what caused these diseases or how to stop them.
It was. People were desperate for cures, for any kind of relief.
And I imagine there was a lot of experimentation going on, trying to figure things out.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And one of the biggest challenges was the threat of cholera epidemics.
Cholera.
Oh, it was a terrifying disease, spread through contaminated water. These epidemics would just sweep through cities, killing thousands.
Just wiping people out. They didn't even understand how it was transmitted.
No, which made it even scarier.
So with limited scientific knowledge, what did people do? I mean, how did they try to treat these diseases?
Well, a lot of people turned to alternative health practices.
Alternative medicine?
Yeah. One popular one was the water cure or hydrotherapy.
Water cure, what's that?
It involved immersing yourself in cold water or using water jets to stimulate circulation.
Sounds kind of relaxing, actually.
Yeah. It was almost like a 19th century spa treatment. And then you had people like Sylvester Graham, who was this big dietary reformer. He advocated for vegetarianism, whole grains, a more natural approach to health.
So kind of like a proto-hippie.
Yeah, kind of. He was ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
But I'm guessing not all the health practices of the time were quite so harmless. There had to be some pretty outlandish ideas floating around as well.
Oh, yeah, definitely. One that comes to mind is phrenology.
Phrenology. That was the one where they thought they could tell your personality by the bumps on your head, right?
Yep, that's the one. They believed different areas of the brain were responsible for different traits, and you could read those traits by examining the shape of the skull.
It's amazing to think that people actually took that seriously.
It's wild, right? But it was a big thing back then.
So you really had this mix of innovation and ignorance when it came to health and science during this time.
You did. People were searching for answers, but they often lacked the scientific understanding to separate fact from fiction.
And I imagine this was especially true in the field of medicine, which was still struggling to establish itself as a legitimate science.
Oh, yeah. Medicine was a whole different ballgame back then.
We're talking about a time before germ theory, before antibiotics, surgeries performed without anesthesia.
Exactly. And one of the biggest problems was the lack of professional standards.
So anyone could just call themselves a doctor.
Pretty much. And this led to a lot of quackery, a lot of mistrust of the medical profession.
It's understandable, though. If you're going to someone for help and they don't even understand basic hygiene, it's hard to have much faith in them.
Yeah, for sure. And without an understanding of germ theory, treatments were often hit or miss.
Like bloodletting. They were still doing that, right?
Yeah.
Even though it was often more harmful than helpful.
Exactly. But there were some advancements being made. For example, the development of anesthesia was a huge breakthrough.
Oh, yeah. Anesthesia. Imagine going through surgery without it.
I know. It revolutionized surgery. It was a game changer.
So who's responsible for that?
Well, in 1844, a dentist named William Morton successfully used ether as an anesthetic during a tooth extraction.
A dentist.
Yeah, imagine that. But even this advancement was met with resistance from some doctors.
Really? Why would they resist something that would clearly help their patients?
Well, some saw it as a threat to their authority. If patients weren't writhing in pain during procedures, maybe they wouldn't need doctors as much.
It's crazy how resistant to change people can be, even when it's clearly for the better.
It is, but despite the challenges, medical science was slowly advancing.
And wasn't this also the time when they were starting to understand the germ theory of disease?
Yes. One of the pioneers was Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was an American physician and writer, and he argued that puerperal fever, which was a deadly infection that often followed childbirth, was spread by doctors who didn't wash their hands properly.
Oh, wow. Hand washing. Such a simple thing, but such a huge impact.
Exactly. And while his ideas were initially met with resistance, they gradually gained acceptance and saved countless lives.
It's a reminder that sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from the simplest solutions.
They do. And along with these efforts to improve health and science, there was also this growing movement to establish universal public education in America.
Okay, public education, that's a huge one. Why was that such a big push during this time?
Well, there was this belief that education was essential for a thriving democracy, that all children, regardless of their social class, should have access to a quality education.
That seems like a pretty radical idea for the time, given the inequalities that existed.
It was. But reformers really thought education as the key to individual opportunity, social mobility, and a more informed and engaged citizenry.
So who were some of the key figures in this movement? Horace Mann.
Yes, Horace Mann was a lawyer and politician, and he became the first secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education in 1837.
And he really championed public education.
Oh, yeah. He implemented all sorts of reforms, lengthened the school year, increased teacher salaries, broadened the curriculum. He also established new methods for training teachers. He wanted to raise the standards of education across the board.
So Massachusetts became a model for other states.
It did. Other states followed their lead, building new schools, creating teacher training colleges. But, the quality of education still varied widely across the country.
Right. I mean, some areas were bound to have more resources than others.
Yeah. Wealthier communities had well-funded schools with qualified teachers, but in rural areas, and especially in the South, schools were often poorly funded and lacked trained teachers.
And of course, in the South, African Americans were largely excluded from education altogether.
Exactly. And even in the North, they often faced discrimination and segregation.
So a long way to go before true equality in education.
Yeah, and this inequality really had lasting consequences. But those early reformers did lay the groundwork for a system of public education that would eventually become a cornerstone of American democracy.
And speaking of equality, this era also saw the birth of the early feminist movement.
Right. Women were demanding a greater role in society, challenging the limitations placed upon them.
And it wasn't just about voting rights, right? It was about a much broader push for equality.
It was. And it's important to note that this movement really grew out of women's involvement in other reform efforts, like abolitionism and temperance.
Oh, that's interesting. So by fighting for others' rights, they began to see the need for their own liberation.
Exactly. They started to see the parallels, the injustices they faced in their own lives.
It's like, if we can fight for the freedom of slaves, why can't we fight for our own freedom as women?
Exactly. And there were some really remarkable women leading the charge during this time.
Let's hear about some of these trailblazers. Who were the key figures?
Well, you had the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina. They were born into a wealthy slaveholding family in South Carolina.
Wow, so they were actually part of the system they were fighting against.
They were. But they became outspoken abolitionists, and they also advocated for women's rights.
It takes a lot of courage to challenge the very system that benefits you.
It does, and they face a lot of criticism, a lot of backlash. Then you had Catherine Beecher, who is a prominent educator. She's a big advocate for women's education and their right to work outside the home.
So she was challenging those traditional notions of women's place in society.
Absolutely. And her sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, would later write Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had a huge impact on the abolitionist movement.
The Beecher sisters, they were a force to be reckoned with.
They were. And then there was Lucretia Mott, who was a Quaker minister and social reformer.
The Quakers were involved in so many of these reform movements.
They were. They were really at the forefront of social change. And Mott was this incredibly gifted speaker and organizer. She brought people together, got them fired up, and really helped push the movement forward.
And working alongside her was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? Another big name in the early feminist movement.
Yes. Stanton was a tireless advocate for women's suffrage. She was a prolific writer and speaker, and she really devoted her life to the cause.
Didn't she help organize the Seneca Falls Convention?
She did. That was in 1848.
The first women's rights convention in the United States. What a pivotal moment.
It was. Over 300 people attended, both men and women, and it was there that they issued the Declaration of Sentiments.
The Declaration of Sentiments. Okay, what's that?
It was modeled after the Declaration of Independence,
Oh, okay.
and it declared that all men and women are created equal and demanded equal rights for women.
Including the right to vote.
Yes.
So this was a pretty radical document for the time.
It was. It really laid the groundwork for the women's suffrage movement, which, as you know, would eventually lead to the passage of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote.
So all those years of struggle finally paid off.
They did. And, it's interesting because a lot of these early feminists, like Lucretia Mott, were Quakers. And their belief in spiritual equality between men and women really shaped their activism.
So we see those connections again. Abolitionism, temperance, feminism, they were all intertwined, drawing strength and inspiration from each other.
Exactly. And the women's rights movement in particular gained valuable experience working alongside abolitionists. They learned how to organize, speak out, and really advocate for social change.
But even within these reform movements, there were differences of opinion about the best way to achieve their goals. And this is especially true when it came to abolitionism.
Right. While most people in the North opposed slavery, there was disagreement about how to actually address it. Some favored a more gradual approach.
Like hoping slavery would just die out on its own.
Yeah. Some even supported sending enslaved African Americans back to Africa.
Wait, what? Sending them back to a continent they never knew?
I know, it seems crazy now. But there's this organization called the American Colonization Society, ACS, that actually advocated for this. They argued it was the best way to end slavery without, disrupting the social and economic order of the South.
It just seems so, I don't know, naive.
It was, and the ACS faced a lot of opposition, particularly from African Americans themselves. I mean, they saw themselves as Americans.
Right. Why should they be forced to leave their home?
Exactly. But as the 19th century progressed, a more radical approach to abolitionism started to emerge, one that called for the immediate and unconditional end to slavery.
And that's where William Lloyd Garrison comes in, right? He was a firebrand demanding immediate emancipation.
He was. Garrison was a journalist, and he founded The Liberator, this newspaper that became the voice of the radical abolitionist movement. And he was uncompromising in his views. He denounced slavery as a sin, called for immediate emancipation, no compensation for slaveholders.
So no compromise, no gradualism, just end it now.
Exactly. And he was willing to challenge anyone who disagreed with him, even other abolitionists who favored a more moderate approach.
But he was kind of a polarizing figure.
Oh, yeah. He was definitely not afraid to ruffle some feathers. But his unwavering moral clarity and his willingness to shake things up, they had a profound impact on the movement.
And it's important to remember that Garrison was just one part of a larger movement.
Right.
That included a lot of dedicated individuals, both black and white, who were all working to end slavery.
And some of the most powerful voices in the movement were those who had actually experienced slavery firsthand.
Yes, black abolitionists played a vital role in the fight for freedom.
They really brought their own unique perspectives and experiences to the movement. They gave it a moral force that was undeniable.
And one of the earliest and most influential black abolitionists was David Walker.
Yes.
Tell me about him. What did he do?
Walker was born free in North Carolina, but he later moved to Boston. And there, he became a successful businessman and a really vocal advocate for black rights. And in 1829, he published An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, this powerful pamphlet that just denounced slavery and called for black resistance.
Wow, that's incredible, especially coming from someone who had witnessed the horrors of slavery firsthand.
It was. His writing had a huge impact on both black and white abolitionists. It really helped galvanize the movement, inspire a new generation of activists.
And of course, we can't talk about black abolitionists without mentioning Frederick Douglass.
Oh, Douglass. His journey from slavery to freedom is truly inspiring.
I mean, to escape from slavery and then become a leading voice for abolition, that's amazing.
It is. He was born into slavery in Maryland, but he managed to escape to freedom in the North in 1838. And he immediately got involved in the abolitionist movement.
What made him such a powerful advocate?
Well, he was an incredible speaker, eloquent, passionate. He could move audiences to tears, to action. He was also a gifted writer.
Didn't he write an autobiography?
He did. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. It was published in 1845, and it became a bestseller.
What an incredible story. It's hard to imagine the courage it took for someone like Douglass to speak out against slavery, especially given the risks involved.
He was risking his life, but he felt it was a fight worth having. He traveled all over the North, speaking out against slavery, demanding equal rights. He even went to Europe, where he was embraced by abolitionists there.
So while white abolitionists like Garrison were important allies, it was the voices of black abolitionists like Walker and Douglas that really gave the movement its true moral force.
Absolutely. Their firsthand experiences, their unwavering commitment to freedom, it made them incredibly powerful advocates. But, as the abolitionist movement gained strength, it also faced fierce opposition, not just in the South, but even in some parts of the North.
Really? I mean, I know the South was pro-slavery, but why would there be opposition to abolitionism in the North?
Well, anti-abolitionist sentiment was actually pretty widespread, fueled by racism, economic interests, and just this fear of social upheaval.
It's hard to imagine that there were people in the North who were actually against ending slavery. What were their arguments?
Well, some argued that slavery was essential to the Southern economy, that ending it would cause economic chaos, ruin the nation.
Profits over people.
Sadly, yes. And then there were those who just held deeply racist beliefs. They believed that black people were inferior and that slavery was their natural state.
It's hard to believe that such views were so prevalent, even in the North.
They were. And these racist attitudes fueled much of the opposition to abolitionism.
Like, they were afraid of what would happen if black people were suddenly free.
Yeah. They feared that freed slaves would come flooding into the North, competing for jobs, disrupting the social order.
Fear and ignorance, a dangerous combination. And these fears often led to violence against abolitionists.
They did. Abolitionists were constantly being harassed, threatened. They were attacked by mobs, their meetings disrupted, their printing presses destroyed.
It's a reminder that fighting for social justice is often dangerous work.
It is. And one of the most tragic examples of this violence was the murder of Elijah Lovejoy.
Elijah Lovejoy.
He was an abolitionist newspaper editor in Illinois.
Okay.
And in 1837, he was killed by a mob while defending his printing press.
A martyr for the cause.
He was. And his death was a turning point for the abolitionist movement.
How so?
It showed how deep the hatred ran, how far people were willing to go to silence those who spoke out against slavery, and it made it clear that this was a fight that wouldn't be won easily.
So even within the abolitionist movement itself, there were these divisions and disagreements about the best way to achieve their goals.
There were. Garrison's insistence on immediate and unconditional emancipation was a real sticking point for some.
Right, they thought he was too radical.
They wanted to work within the existing political system, try to achieve change through legislation.
So a more gradual approach.
Yeah. And there was also disagreement about the role of women in the movement.
Oh, right. Garrison was a strong supporter of women's rights.
He was, and that alienated some of the more traditional folks.
Yeah.
And then there was Garrison's pacifism.
Pacifism, like he was against all violence.
Right. He believed that violence was never the answer. But that put him at odds with those who felt that force might be necessary to end slavery.
So lots of different opinions on how to win this fight.
Exactly. And Garrison's call for the North to secede from the South, well, that further divided the movement.
So the abolitionist movement, while united in its opposition to slavery, was also a very complex and dynamic coalition with a range of viewpoints and strategies.
It was. And these divisions, while frustrating at times, also reflected the movement's dynamism, its willingness to engage in debate and challenge itself.
But ultimately, the abolitionist movement had a profound impact on American society, wouldn't you say?
No, absolutely. They raised awareness about the horrors of slavery. They challenged the nation's conscience. And ultimately, I think they contributed to the coming of the Civil War, which finally brought about the end of slavery.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the face of such overwhelming opposition, a small group of dedicated individuals can make a real difference.
They can. The abolitionist movement, with all its complexities and contradictions, it stands as a testament to the power of ideas to change the world.
Well said. It's been an incredible journey exploring this period with you.
I agree.
And I want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us on this deep dive into antebellum culture and reform. We hope it's given you a new perspective on this pivotal era in American history. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a better world.